So, welcome to this edition of 22nd Century Live with Ken. Uh, for those of you that are new to the podcast, you'll be able to see it on LinkedIn. You may be watching it on YouTube. It'll also be an audio version. Today, I'm fortunate to have with me an amazing guest, Vicky Oliver, and she's a leading career development expert and the multi-best-selling author of 5 books, including 301 Smart Answers to Tough Interview Questions. So, Vicky, you want to tell us a little more about your background?
Oh, sure. Thanks for asking. I have written 5 books to the stressed out corporate professional, helping that person deal with finding a job, and then after that, deal with the interesting personalities that they find at the office. So I wrote 301 Smart Answers to Tough Interview Questions, helps prime people on the grueling interview process. And then after that, I wrote a book called Bad Bosses, Crazy Coworkers, and Other Office Idiots, which I think most people have run into at least one of those. And, it just helps people deal with the devil, whether they're wearing Prada or not.
Yeah, and that was such a classic movie. I like that movie as far as a relationship because I've worked for people like that. I understand how what it's like. In fact, when I teach my class, I talk about the crazy people I used to work for in California. They were the nicest people outside the building, but when they walked in, they checked their brains at the door, and it was very definitely a Jekyll and Hyde transition.
Right.
You made a statement that I'm going to mention, and we'll talk about this because you said that 1 in 4 workers plans to look for a new job in the coming months. And I find that if I was a business owner, that would scare me. But I see that as reality, looking at the job transitions and I have conversations with managers that can't find help and are losing people.
Yeah. I think part of it is definitely has to do with the pandemic, that we've all been sitting in our metaphorical closets, working from our homes and our home offices. And we've had a chance to evaluate whether or not the mission of the companies that we work for aligns with our own values. And when it doesn't, these days, there's more time to reflect on that because there's no commute time to work. You can just sort of roll out of bed and start working and do it on your own time. And it gives you more thinking time to assess whether or not you're pleased. And I think a lot of workers, aren't happy right now and they just want to, get out and find a different place. It doesn't mean that they'll be more successful on the other place, but they feel like this sort of cabin fever to get out.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that there's, in the past, there's been maybe some challenges with finding a job so that the people were less reluctant to change jobs. Whereas now, everywhere I drive around town, I mean, when McDonald's is paying a hiring bonus,
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly. Right. Yeah. There's like this itch, that people want to scratch. And it's like if they didn't look before, now's the opportunity to look. Plus, they've been in their homes, Plus, now that we have a hybrid work model, a lot of people are only working in the actual office 2 days a week, So people have more time to think and to plan ahead. And I think that, it depends on which side you're sitting on. You know what I mean? If you're a worker, this is great news. If you're an employer, it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like I said, I'm working with a company right now, and one of the challenges they're having is hiring technicians and getting them to stay. And I think part of it is the generational change too. I did some research on Google. It's actually a project that my class has to do. Was to find out what the average length of time a millennial expects to stay in the job, and the answer is 3 years.
Right. That's so funny. That's so funny. I mean, my stepfather was in his job for like 30 years, just by comparison. I mean, things have really, really, really super changed. I get, right now, if people aren't being promoted, if they're not being rewarded, if they're not feeling good about it, it's like, yeah, why not leave? Why not get skills elsewhere?
Okay. So let me ask you then, what are some of the things, let's start with some of the things that the employer could change to reduce that risk that his employees are going to go somewhere else?
Right. So I'd say the first thing, it sounds so simple, but I'd say the first thing is to show appreciation to your workers, to thank them, to show that they're valuable, to give them like the metaphorical pat on the back. You know what I mean? Just knowing when you're a worker, just knowing that your boss really appreciates that you're working hard can really help you want to stay at a place. If you feel like somebody believes in you and they're championing you. So that would be like the first easy thing I would suggest.
You know, and that's interesting because I touch on both of those in my class. The first one, and you're probably familiar with the book, The 1 Minute Manager?
Oh, of course.
You know, and he talks in there about the 1 minute praising. That's one of the things that I encourage my students in class to think about doing, is to look for what your people are doing right. We live in such a negative environment that we're so often conditioned, and growing up we were probably conditioned to look for what was wrong and what was bad. And it's one of those things, if I could go back and change how I raised my son, I would look more for what was right than what is wrong. And so in the workplace, if we do that, then if you're always finding the flaws, not finding the good, you wind up criticizing them and making people, I think, more prone to want to leave, to get out of that environment. It becomes toxic almost.
Yeah, it's just too easy to say, you know what, this person doesn't get me. My boss doesn't get me, and I'm like now going to jump ship. And now there's so many opportunities to do it, and also, I mean, just in terms of job hunting itself, I mean, you could, even if you were working full time in a place, in the office, like after hours, you could go on LinkedIn, you can find other job opportunities. I mean, it's so much easier to kind of look around and to keep an eye open. But yeah, I do agree with you about appreciation. I do think looking for the good is important. I also feel that, especially like, let's say an employee, needs criticism, they need feedback. I think that the way that the feedback is delivered is also critical. And, we always hear this thing about the compliment sandwich, right? Like you say something that's the person's doing well, right? And then you say something that could be improved, and then you end with something that's doing well. But the truth is, people don't hear very well. Once you start in on the critical part, their ears shut off. And I actually think it's better to try to have more compliments in the compliment sandwich, to really sort of find like, 2 things, 3 things that the person's doing well, and then talk about the area that could use improvement, because it'll help them hear it better.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's interesting because you mentioned the compliment cookie. I say it a little differently, but that's, again, one of those things I talk to them about. And again, that's one of the principles in 1 Minute Manager, is the fact that you want to, when they leave, they want to walk out of the room feeling that you have confidence that they're going to succeed at fixing whatever the challenge is.
Right.
Because if they don't feel good about themselves, again, it goes back to then they think, well, maybe I should do something else.
Right.
And that is such a challenge, and it's so hard to do that, because most of us, like I said, in our background and in our work experience, a lot of them, we wind up in that same kind of situation.
Right.
So, you mentioned about removing unnecessary demands, and so you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is for employers to put themselves in their workers' shoes, and especially depending on the person's general age, right? And some people, if they're very young, maybe their whole timeline is different. All their expectations are different, and they expect to either rise and soar, or they're going to go. And it's like we're living in kind of, I call it like a gig economy right now too, where amassing skills is the key thing rather than years at a place, and seniority, quote unquote seniority, is more about the skills. So I would say try to look at things that are challenging where the person can grow. Right. And if they can't, because the thing is so clerical, so dull, so boring, and there's no way around it, then position that as like, this is a due that you have to pay, but you do this, and then we're going to look for opportunities for you to expand and to grow. And if you are a champion of that person's growth, then they're going to love you and they're going to stay with you. And it's not just superficial. I mean, are you planning with them like how they're going to grow? Are you working with them like to make sure that they get promoted, that they pass certain benchmarks? Are you trying to like really push them? It can't just be cosmetic. I think it has to be really sincere, and you need to together work with your workers on their growth.
Yeah, and I'm loving the conversation because you and I are on the same page in so many ways. One of the things that I talk about for my managers is the fact that they need to mentor their employees, and to first of all, the people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So you can't fake it. If you want to mentor somebody, you have to be sincerely interested in what they want. And I said, sometimes if you mentor them, they're going to leave their current role. And I said, that's okay. Even if they leave the company, that is okay, because everybody else will see how you help that person achieve the success they want. And they'll believe you'll do that for them. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And I love what you said about, these dead end jobs kinds of things. I talked to the service managers about if you're interviewing in a millennial, I said, the one thing you don't want to do is take them back into the back of the service department and say, hey, I want you to meet Joe. He's been a technician here for 40 years. If you don't have the doors locked, that millennial's gone, because he doesn't want to be a technician for 40 years.
Right, exactly.
He wants a career path. He wants to be able to move and go forward.
Right. Now, for workers out there, I think that sometimes it's important to actually take ownership of your own path, because nobody is going to be able to mentor anybody as well as they deserve it. You know what I mean? Like in the end, one has to take agency of one's own path, right? But finding mentors either inside your company or outside your company will, I think, smooth the process.
Oh, I think so too. And I think, this is another thing that I talk to service managers about is it's their job to build people that are self-managing, self-reliant, that are actually basically leaders in their own right. I say that every good leader is somebody that builds other leaders in their organization.
Right.
And so as somebody that's heading a department, as they start to work with and build their employees so that they can be self-motivating, and develop basically the capabilities to be self-managing, it does two things. First of all, it inspires confidence in the workers, and I think it builds a lot into job satisfaction. And the second thing is it makes the manager's job so much easier.
Yes, this is true. I feel like there are always mentors to be found. And even if it's not ingrained, if it may not be in the DNA of the company per se to have the mentorship program in place, but you can be, as a worker, one can be guided to find people who will help. I mean, a mentor just means somebody who cares about you and who is going to give you great advice. That's it. They don't have to be in your department, that doesn't have to be your boss. I mean, it's better if it's your boss or your direct supervisor, but it doesn't have to be. It can be somebody else. Yeah.
No, I like that. That is so true. I saw something else. Let me go back to this for a second. You talked about this. I'm going to go back to positive feedback and rewarding accomplishments. One of the things that I think a lot of companies are bad about, and I'll pick on the industry that I know very well, which is the copier and office equipment business, is there are people in companies that sometimes, or let me say roles in companies that get recognition and get rewards, and there are other roles that don't. It used to make me so crazy. I worked for one of the manufacturers. I won't call out the brand name, but every so often we'd have to go back to the headquarters in New England, and we'd go in, and they would have an awards dinner. It was like for the national sales meeting, and they had an awards dinner, and every salesperson that got it just met their quota, which basically means they did their job. They got an award. Unless you did something heroic as a service person to help a sales guy, you didn't get anything. But the only thing that made that meeting was tolerable was an open bar and a good meal.
Right.
And you walked out of it so demoralized because, I had never, ever failed to exceed my expectations. And in all the years I worked for people,
Right.
And you walk out, well, those guys just barely did their job and got a plat.
Right.
I got nothing.
Right. Right.
So I think that's really important. And in organizations that you think about that, the recognition needs to be comparable no matter what role a person is. In other words, an admin person, if they excel, they should get rewarded. A service person, a salesperson, whoever it is.
Right. Right. Especially, I would say, with like the younger generation now, because that generation is used to receiving a lot of rewards. You know what I mean? They're used to receiving like awards for participation, awards for showing up, this type of thing. So I think it's really important. You don't want it to be, a demoralizing experience for anybody. And also, I mean, if anybody's working in a company that does that, I think, try to bring it to the attention of the higher ups there so that things are more fairly rewarded.
Yeah. Except if you're one of the people that are being ignored, nobody appreciates you bringing it up, especially in major corporations.
We need a new award.
Yeah, give you an award right out the door. And it's interesting because in last week's podcast, I interviewed Dr. Nina Such, and she talked about leading with love. And about having to have care and think about it and concern for your employees. And I thought that was so good. And then the next question I have for you goes back to an interview I did. I think it was either the week before that or 2 weeks before. And you talk about injecting fun into the workplace.
Yes.
So tell me about that.
Okay, good. So first of all, my background, it comes from advertising, where we tried to simulate play into the brainstorming process. And a lot of times when employees feel like it's fun, you can have maybe a competitive aspect. Maybe it's like one team against another team, but if there's like a sense of fun and joy in doing it, it's just better all the way around. So there again, like they used to say, like, there are no stupid questions, right? Or there are no stupid ideas. I mean, there are plenty of dumb ideas, but in a brainstorming session, like the worst thing that you can do is say, oh, that's so dumb. Or, oh, we did that last year. We did it before. Like, just have it be like an open slate where people can contribute their ideas and feel good about, putting like an idea up on the wall, so to speak, and encourage that. And then when you encourage that sense of openness and fun about it, you're probably going to get more ideas, right? And some of them will be terrible and some of them will be fantastic. And you can sift through those ideas later. You don't have to have like the brainstorming meeting be the place where you say this one versus that one. You can get 100 ideas up on the wall, and then later you can winnow it down to the top 2 or 3. I think your crop of ideas will be better and your employees will be happier.
Oh, I agree so much. And it was interesting. It's one of those other things that frustrated me about corporate life is in big corporations, managers tend to build silos. So again, going back to my background, we had a department that was responsible for providing customer service and helping technicians solve problems.
Right.
But there was a lot of reasons for it, but their philosophy was tell them to change something and get them off the phone.
Right.
Well, that doesn't help the technician. If I went into work in that department, what would happen is everybody in their department would get mad at me because if I spent 3 hours on the phone with a tech fixing the problem, I was fine with that.
Right.
And everybody else is looking at the whole time and all these other things. And I'm like, no, that doesn't matter. And so I tried to provide some suggestions to this other department, and my manager told me to shut up. Their manager told me to shut up. Nobody wanted to hear it. And I'm like, but we could fix it. It was something that could be fixed and made the company so much better and in the long run more profitable if people would listen.
Right.
And so that is so frustrating.
It is frustrating.
One of the things you talked about, the no bad ideas, in a brainstorming session, if somebody throws out an idea, what? That's an interesting idea. What could we do to make it better?
Yeah.
So you could take and build on somebody's idea to maybe to the point that it doesn't even look like their original idea, but they felt like they were part of it.
Right. Right. I mean, you can piggyback onto other people's ideas. The other thing is, I mean, just if you happen to be sitting in one of those brainstorming meetings, another thing you can do is you can like somebody else's idea. It's not a competition really there. Right there, it should just be more like volleying ideas. And then later you can refine them and make them fantastic.
Yeah, no, I agree so much with that. And it was one of the previous podcasts I was talking to somebody. He talked about the fact that one of the companies he worked with had basically a policy in place that encouraged people to fail occasionally.
Yes,
because
it's like that too.
Yeah, because what happens is if everybody's afraid to fail, then nobody's going to try anything new, and you're not ever going to make any real progress.
Yeah, I worked at a place like that also in my advertising career. There's a living. I mean, excuse me. Now he's passed, but he was a legend in his field, Bill Bernbach, and he called it the freedom to fail, and that was part of the DNA of that ad agency, that you had the freedom to fail, which means basically you have to stretch. You have to stretch, and then you will fail occasionally because you're stretching so hard. And if you can't do that, if you're working in a place where you just have to say yes, yes, yes all the time, you're probably not going to grow. The quality of the ideas will be duller over time because everybody's trying to second guess everybody else. So, you're trying to second guess your boss, and your boss is trying to second guess her boss, and it sort of becomes a groupthink experience. So that's not that healthy in terms of creativity.
Yeah, I don't thrive in those kinds of organizations. If somebody says to me that this is the way we've always done it, that's immediately the clue that we need to reevaluate that.
Yeah.
I'm the kind of guy that everybody else is saying, don't rock the boat. And I'm like, here, let me see what happens when I shake it really good. See what happens.
Sometimes you have to rock the boat.
Yeah, but I think that it's in companies like that encourage those kinds of behaviors are places that people like to work. I think people feel safe to work. And I think those are the companies that succeed in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think they keep their workers sharpest, whether or not people having a sense of play doesn't mean, going out and playing tennis or whatever, you know what I mean? You still have to work really hard to be that creative, to come up with the ideas. But I'd say encouraging people, realizing that they're not always going to be hitting it out of the ballpark, they're sometimes going to fail drastically and fall down on their face. And then you have to have the spirit of okay, now get up again,
Yeah. Yeah, it was, there's a lot of gamification that's starting to come into work. Yeah. And it kind of reminds me of the Boy Scouts, and I was never a Boy Scout, but Boy Scouts spend their time in the Boy Scouts collecting badges for doing different things.
Right.
And I think now that's one of those things that young people coming into the workplace is, an award for this, an award for that, something to symbolize that they've accomplished something that, it's kind of like the gold star on the report card when you were in elementary school, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, calling it the gamification is really interesting. I think that's really true. There's all those apps where you get a reward just for walking in, to a Starbucks or something, right?
Uh-huh.
You go to your dentist, a few times and you get a reward for going back to the same place. And I think, yes, to the extent that it can be like a game where it's fun to go to work, that is what you want to encourage always.
Yeah. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm a fan of to where we can make it possible team awards. So that, that you set a goal, for example, for a team to approve in something, because that way I think it builds this interdependence upon each other and helps build them into a team rather than a bunch of individuals competing against, the fellow worker.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think that the team award idea is fantastic. I really love that. And it does sort of, if there's a team award, it kind of reduces, you don't want cutthroat competition. to come up with like the best ideas, because it's okay once in a while, I think, to have the cutthroat competition. Let's say you're pitching a new business and like everybody has to jump really high. I think that's okay once in a while, but I think if you do it all the time for every single thing, it gets exhausting. It gets too tiring to be so competitive, and you're better like all rowing together.
Yeah, I think so too. Because if everybody's rowing together, you make progress.
Yeah.
If you got everybody rowing at their own pace, all you get is the oars hitting each other. And I love your analogy, the rowing, because I hadn't even thought about that. But that is exactly what we're looking for in a company.
Yeah, and also the nights that you do have to work late, it's better when you feel friendly with the people too. When it's like your whole team is like working together, it's much better.
Yeah. So what do you think? And because I'm a kind of fan, and I talk a little bit with my guys in the classes about doing some, and some team building activities are overdone, but I think that there is some advantage to doing some team building things and to doing some things as a team is fun. An example that comes to mind is I worked with a gentleman. He worked at a dealership, but I was supporting the dealership, and he had a cabin on the lake, and every once in a while he'd invite his whole team to come up to the cabin, and they'd all go fishing or play golf together or do something, and it wasn't mandatory, but he provided, a lot of the things they needed. Basically, they had to bring their sleeping bags and their fishing rods, and the rest of it, it was pretty well taken care of.
Yeah.
So
I really like that idea, because then people get to see each other when they're not at the office. They get to, understand each other's families and their hobbies. And, it's more round. It's like more dimensional to understand the people that you work with, like everything about them, not just like how they are at the office. And sometimes, sometimes I've found that people can have certain tics at the office that don't serve them particularly well. Like, for example, I know a guy, he writes terrible emails, right? The emails have no tone. They're not particularly polite. They're very curt, right? And you have to deal with a person like that at the office. But then when you get to know them a little bit outside the office, and you realize like they've got a family and, they have children or whatever, it makes you more compassionate, I think, for individual like tics that you might not particularly appreciate at the office. I mean, not everybody, is perfect. And it just helps you, I think, see them in a more realistic and better light to take them off campus.
I love your thing about three-dimensional, because, sometimes with you people that we work with, they're kind of like cardboard cutouts.
Right.
That they're a suit that fills a chair or something. And instead now they're in reality, they are this three-dimensional person. And so when they're having a bad day, it's maybe they've got a sick wife or they're struggling with, something, and you start to, if you understand people, and that in any kind of business transaction, if you understand the person better, you're going to wind up with better results, I think, in the environment, no matter whether it's sales environment. If you understand what the client wants, you understand what your boss is like, all of those things, I think, make a huge difference.
Yeah. I mean, also, like in my books, I talk a lot about hobbies, and people have different hobbies, and sometimes that's the way to actually reach them, is through some sort of a hobby. Maybe you share a hobby, or something about their hobby. And, when worse comes to worse, like you're just sitting there like at a dinner table with them, like pre-COVID days or whatever, and you have nothing to talk about because you don't want to talk about work. Well, you can talk about their hobby. And that way you can bond over that, and it's just showing an interest in somebody else. You don't have to actually, both play golf together. It's like that person plays golf and a little bit about it, or they go to a museum and a little bit about it. Just something where you're showing your humanity and you're interested in them as a whole person.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, listen, Vicky, I really appreciate you being with you. And I know this wasn't a great day for you, and I appreciate you showing up. I've enjoyed our conversation so much. We'll say goodbye to the audience. I'll chat with just a second afterwards. And for everybody that's watching, again, if you're watching it on YouTube, do me a favor, please subscribe. If you're watching it on LinkedIn, please follow me or follow 22nd Century Management. If you're listening on the podcast, I appreciate it if you subscribe to the podcast. All of those things will help. I try every week to bring a good information. Actually, let me see. I'm not where I can see real easily what next week. One of these days I'll remember who's my guest for the following week. But every week I have good guests. We have some interesting conversations. Like I said, Vicky, I appreciate you being here. We'll say goodbye to everybody. You have a good week.
For having me.